I'm Tom Hyder. I'm a volunteer docent at the UMLAUF Sculpture Garden here in Austin, Texas. Today we're going through the garden looking at some of the more interesting works by Charles UMLAUF, perhaps America's most prolific sculptor of the 20th century. As we've been going around the garden, we've been looking at different works by Charles that were either in cast stone or bronze being the most common of Charles' sculptures. But look at the one behind me. This is really a unique sculpture. This sculpture is in aluminum. And aluminum is one of those metals that sculptors don't really care to work at, and the people in the foundries where the items are cast, they really hate working in aluminum. And why is that? Because they work with bronze every day. They know all the properties of bronze. They know the proper temperature where it's going to melt and when it's going to cool. You throw a different metal into the process and it really makes things a lot more difficult. So you're thinking to yourself, then why the heck did Charles make this piece in aluminum? Because the person who commissioned the work asked for it to be in aluminum. And who was that? Marion Koogler McNay. Now some of you maybe have been to the McNay Museum in San Antonio, Texas. It's actually in her former home. It's a beautiful art museum in the city of San Antonio. So Charles and Marion had known each other for a number of years. She had also studied at the Chicago Art Institute briefly when Charles was studying there. And so one day she asked Charles to create the crucifixion that you see behind me that would be placed at her graveside. She had picked out a cemetery plot in a graveyard that was next to a convent. So basically the graveyard was for deceased nuns. But Marion had been a strong supporter of the convent, and they had agreed she could be buried there. So she wanted a crucifixion at the graveside. Now, the final piece that Charles created is probably about 3 times the size of this one here. This is what we call a scale model. And most of the pieces we see around the garden are scale models. And artists create scale models generally for 2 purposes. On the one hand, they want to see how that final work is going to look. Is it, coming out the way it should? But more importantly, in the case of Charles, he had had a lifelong dream of someday having a sculpture garden where he could display some of his most prominent works. He didn't know if that sculpture garden was going to be in this spot, but it was always a dream of his. So when he would be creating some of his more noteworthy pieces, he would often create a scale model that he would put in storage in the hopes and dreams of one day having a beautiful garden like this where he could display them. So a few things that are interesting about this piece. This was not the original crucifixion that Charles created for Mrs. McNay. The original one, and he put together a clay model for her, was a much more graphic crucifixion. It was one of those that you looked at and you just almost jerked away. It just was shocking to look at. And when Marion first looked at that clay model, she admired it. She said, "Oh, Charles, that is a beautiful piece of work." But she said, "To tell you the truth, Charles," she said, "I can't have it at my graveside." And Charles was like, "Well, why? What's wrong with it? You just said it's a beautiful piece." She said, "I have to be honest with you, Charles. If we put that in the cemetery, it's going to scare the bejeebers out of those nuns." So Charles went back to the drawing board and he created this crucifixion. And if you look at this crucifixion, remember we talked a few minutes ago about the Pieta and how when artists copy a work that other artists have done in the past, they always try to put a little bit of their own spin on the work. Well, let's look at this crucifixion here. And what is one of the things that's really unique about it? Think about how many crucifixions you've seen in the past, and in almost every instance, Christ's head is hanging down. Christ is already dead. In this one, he's looking up. So we know it's moments before he's died. Also, take a look at where he's looking off to the right. Remember in the Bible, it talks about God the Father is on the right hand. Also, notice the right hand with the finger pointing. We don't know for certain, but it's quite probable that what Charles is indicating there is Christ is pointing towards the good thief. Because once again, the Bible story tells us that the good thief was on Christ's right-hand side. So those are a couple little distinguishing features that Charles put into his Crucifixion that really is just a marvelous piece.